since we have addressed ourselves to our first belief that everything happens for a reason, we have pretty well, I think, debunked that idea. And there'll be a final paper I'll hand out to you at the end of the series that will include the conclusions.
I've already seen it.
To
It's
that.
a fill-in-blank
But
test.
today we start on a second.
Makeup time then.
Yeah, we're going to start on a second belief today, and that is that God helps those who help themselves. And the scripture reference for this particular lesson comes from the Psalms. First of all, from Psalms 10:14b and 17 and 18a. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed. And then from Psalm 18:6 and 16, in my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. And from his temple he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. And from Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2, I lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The way we're going to approach this one. First of all, we're going to talk about whether or not there's a biblical basis, or whether there is a lack of biblical basis for this particular belief. We're going to take a look at one way in which the statement is kind of true, okay? But then we're going to take a look at a couple of reasons why actually this belief is false. And then at the end we'll draw some conclusions on this one. All right? So we start out, is this in the Bible or not? There was a televised segment on one of these talk show things where a person goes out on the street with a microphone and just randomly picks people and asks them a question, you know. And numerous people randomly selected on the street were asked a very simple question. Name one of the 10 Commandments. You wouldn't believe the number of people who said, God helps those who help themselves.
Really? Interesting.
Of course, that's not one of the 10 Commandments.
Pretty sad.
Another survey showed that 8 out of 10 Americans think that that statement is in the Bible somewhere. And more than half of all respondents were strongly convinced that this was one of the major themes of the entire Bible. Well, guess what? The Bible doesn't contain any such verse anywhere in it, Old or New Testament. The belief, apparently, as near as the experts can figure, originated in Greek mythology, about 500 BC. And there have been a lot of philosophers and theologians over the centuries that have adopted it and repeated it ever since, right down to the birth of the United States of America,
You don't want to sit there.
when Ben Franklin, in 1736, popularized it in Poor Richard's Almanac. Good for old Ben. So, this statement is not in the Bible. But, can we find any biblical truth, okay, to
What
this
is the
idea
statement?
at all?
God
The Lord helps.
Oh, it helps yourself.
Well, in a way, it sort of captures a biblical teaching. But in other ways, it just doesn't work out to be true at all. In fact, it sends a message that is really the direct opposite of the intention and the meaning of the Bible itself. It actually presents us with some spiritual fictions that we really need to take a look at and kind of rebut. And I have three little stories here to make a point from our author, Adam Hamilton. When I sit down to eat, I say a mealtime blessing. But just because I prayed doesn't mean food magically appears on my plate. That would be a good way to go hungry. I worked for my supper by earning a paycheck. We went to the effort of buying groceries and preparing the meal. When I bow my head before eating, I am thanking God for the capacity to earn a living. I'm thanking God for a planet that sustains our life, for all the farmers who work to plant and harvest the crops, for the truckers who brought it to the grocery store, and for the people who handled it. Ultimately, the food I eat comes from God, but it only appears because I and many others did our part. Second example. Consider employment. If I were unemployed and simply sat around praying, please God, give me a job, it might be a long wait before I become employed once more. Instead, it would be important for me to prepare a resume, actively look for job openings, submit applications, go to interviews, and try to convince employers that I was well qualified for the job. Without this work on my part, it's likely I would remain unemployed. Third, he says, I think of a couple who were trying to sell their home some years ago. They prayed for a buyer. At church, they turned in prayer request cards for the home to sell. They actually borrowed a plastic statue of St. Joseph from a friend and buried it head first next to the real estate sign.
I heard something like that.
Yeah.
Months went by without a nibble.
Oh wait, that works.
Not in this case. Months went by without a nibble. All along, their real estate agent had told them that they were asking too much for the property. The couple came and spoke with me about it, expressing their disappointment with God for not answering their prayers. I suggested that, given the agent's counsel, what they really had been praying for was that God would send them someone willing to pay $10,000 more for their home than it was worth. Finally, they listened to the agent's advice and lowered the price by $10,000. The house sold within a few days.
There you go.
The moral of these stories is this. God is not going to drop food on your dinner table. God is not going to force someone to hire you for a job when someone else is better qualified. And God is not going to make people spend more money on your home than it's worth. You can pray until you turn blue in the face. It's not going to change things. To change anything, you have to do some work in the process. God has given us brains and strength and wisdom. God even provides us with other people who can provide and support for us, advise us. Those are gifts from God. But we have to put them to use. So, we pray and then we work. Okay? On his second missionary journey, the Apostle Paul founded the church at Thessalonica. And he had told those folks to trust in Jesus Christ and to trust that he was likely to come back at any moment. What was the result? There were a lot of converts in Thessalonica that mistakenly assumed that trusting in Jesus meant they could quit their jobs and sit around waiting for the second coming. Geez, I'm glad we don't have people who do things like that today, aren't you? No reason to be careful any longer with your money either. I mean, spend it all, get rid of it, because God would provide everything for it. When word reached Paul about this, he had a fit. And he wrote to them this comment. from Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, chapter 3, verses 10 and 12. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If a man will not work, he will not eat. Well, that seems simple enough, doesn't it? Trusting in Jesus does not mean you pray and then God takes care of everything. Rather, our faith is meant to move us into action even while we simultaneously trust in God.
It's interesting when you read on Thessalonians, that part. Not only did he say, go to work, he then said, if anyone doesn't obey our instructions in this letter, take special note of him. Do not associate with him in order that he may feel ashamed.
In other words,
shun him.
right.
If they won't work, shun him.
On March 7th, 2015, all over the country that day, people were marking the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama. A day that had come to be called Bloody Sunday. I'm sure we've all been around long enough to remember those days. You may know quite a bit of the story as a result, but in 1965, African Americans in Alabama were being blocked from exercising their right to vote. In order to register, they were subjected to absurd tests and questions that nobody could answer. As one example, African Americans had to guess the exact number of jelly beans in a large jar before they could register to vote. The clear intent was to keep them disenfranchised, of course. Well, in response, people began to organize, and churches were at the center of it. During a peaceful demonstration, church deacon Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot by a state trooper and later died of his wounds. At a meeting at Zion Methodist Church in Marion, Alabama, a call went out for a larger nonviolent march from Selma to Montgomery. And on Sunday, March the 7th, approximately 600 marchers gathered for worship in their churches, then met at Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. They began with a prayer, and then they went out about nonviolently protesting for their rights, and they prayed for strength, and then they worked. Leading the march was John Lewis, a young seminary student who has served in the United States Congress for some 30 years. The other leader was Jose Williams, an ordained Baptist pastor who went on to serve in politics and social causes. The group planned to march 54 miles, but they had barely gotten underway before police blocked them as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The police attacked, some were on horseback, and the people who started their day in church were physically beaten for their efforts to march. More than 50 were hospitalized. John Lewis suffered a fractured skull. These church people did not simply pray and wait for God to fix things. They lived out the idea of praying and working. They were willing to sacrifice and even to risk death because they believed God was calling them to work on behalf of a just and moral cause. Bloody Sunday was a turning point in the civil rights movement. It galvanized more support for the cause. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. came to Selma and led another march, and then another, and later that year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. So, we can say that in a sense, there's some truth to the idea that God helps those who help themselves. Okay, you following so far? We don't sit around on our thumbs waiting for God to miraculously right the wrongs in society. Remember, God works through people. Okay? We are God's instruments. He uses us to bring about change in the world. But prayer is necessary because that is what empowers us and can help guide us into action. Those folks who fought for civil rights did not simply appear in church one day and pray. They did pray. But then they marched, knowing full good and well that they were likely to be beaten and arrested. But they also trusted that God would see them through. So, there is some truth to the idea that God helps those who help themselves if you approach it from that angle, okay? But now let's see why this belief is fundamentally not biblical at all. This phrase, God helps those who help themselves, is sometimes used as a way of avoiding our Christian responsibilities to help other people. Of acting on the belief that we should love our neighbors. The fact is, guys, that there are a lot of people in the world, a lot of people in America who just simply cannot help themselves. For example, people who are trapped in poverty, people who are buried in financial debt. You know, help isn't just a simple matter of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. It doesn't work that way. How many people have you known in your lifetime? I think we all have, so deeply buried in a hole, they just simply have no chance of climbing out of that hole. At least without help from somebody.
Maybe it would have been better if they would have said, God helps those who help others.
Yeah. The way it was explained to me the first time I got to thinking seriously about this, decades ago in our society, if you were down and out, okay, there was a stepladder you could move up one step at a time to climb out of that. In more recent decades, the bottom couple of rungs on that stepladder are removed. You can't even get to the first rung anymore without some kind of help. Adam Hamilton says, I remember a man I met when I was 23 years old. I had just graduated from seminary. The man was homeless and was asking for money. I imagined that I could help turn his life around in no time at all. When the man saw me, he asked, hey, can you spare some money for lunch? And I said, I'll do better than that. I'll take you to lunch. Well, he agreed, and so we went to lunch together. I happened to have a copy of our newspaper, the Kansas City Star, and after I paid for the man's lunch, I said, you know, I'd love to see you get a job. How about if I help you with that? Well, he looked at me and he said, well, sure. Why don't you help me with that? I suggested we start with a basic resume, and I wrote down his name. When I asked for his contact information, he said, dude, I don't have a phone. I don't have an address. So we skipped that. I moved on to ask him about his education and found out that it was limited to 7th grade. I asked for references. If I had references, he said, I wouldn't be out here on the street. Well, I said, why don't we just look at the classified ads and see what we can find that you might be qualified for. What I really found out after a couple of hours with this man was how little I knew about the situations in which many homeless people find themselves. And you know that's true.
Guess we're Homeless Connect.
Yeah. You know, we should all do what we reasonably can to support ourselves. But there are people who face challenges and they just simply don't have any idea how to approach these problems. They don't have any idea in the world how they can overcome these problems. They don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the resources to do anything about it. They're just lost. Therefore, we should never duck our own obligations by saying, well, you know, I'd help the guy, but only if he first shows their own efforts to improve first. God commands and expects his people to show special concern for the poor, for the orphan, for the widow, for the needy, the depressed, the grieving. And this is the same lesson we find in, too bad Terry McLean isn't here, Leviticus 23:22. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. You understand what connection that has to this lesson? God is giving a serious command here to farmers. They must intentionally leave part of their crop unharvested. Instead of consuming it themselves or making a profit from it, they've got to leave it there. So those people who are not able to make ends meet can harvest their own grain and have some food to eat. People who might otherwise starve. This is a very compassionate command, and it's also rooted in the dignity of work and allows the poor to work and harvest a portion for themselves.
But here, the person who needs help is going out and doing some work, and are helping themselves. Now, someone helped them to help themselves.
That's right.
But they did have to do something.
That's right.
And I think the same thing with the homeless person he talked to. The person at least showed some interest in talking to him. It's whether, if someone needs help, they've got to show an interest. It's hard to just help somebody
If they're totally unmotivated.
aren't motivated, aren't interested in helping themselves. To some extent, there's nothing you can do for them.
Well, the moral of this story is going to be, each of us is obligated to do what we can for ourselves. But if that isn't enough, then we are going to need help from there to do what needs
We all
to be
need
done.
help throughout our whole
well,
life. I mean,
We all need help. My own self personally, sometimes I think I'm beyond help, but that's beside the point.
Well, you must have at least a skill or two.
Oh, well, I used to.
Well, you can still read.
This thing also recognized the fact that God is the ultimate source of all wealth and property. I mean, the idea is that the farmer is not being forced to share his wealth because his fields were not his to begin with. I mean, they belonged to God from the beginning anyway, right? So, in Scripture, God constantly calls us to help those who cannot help themselves, or those who require outside help before they can help themselves. And I have 5 interesting little examples. James 1:27. He writes these familiar words in the New Testament. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties. Matthew 25 and Luke 10, in the parables of the sheep and goats and of the Good Samaritan, Jesus tells us God judges us not only by our faith, but by whether our faith has led us to a greater compassion for the poor and needy. Paul says that we are saved by the kind of faith that moves our hearts to action, faith working through love, Galatians 5:6. Proverbs captures the twin ideas of praying and working. In Proverbs 10:4, the author writes, laziness brings poverty, hard work makes one rich. Gosh, I've worked hard all my life and I'm not rich. What happened there?
That's not always true.
Rich in
is it?
Get that
Rich
definition
in
of rich.
spirit.
Rich in something. Rich in spouse.
Aww.
You're good for another week.
You get an A today, Brian.
Yeah, you do.
And then Proverbs 19:17 adds, those who are gracious to the poor lend to the Lord, and the Lord will fully repay them. Elsewhere in Proverbs, you'll find these verses of wisdom. Those who close their ears to the cries of the poor will themselves call out but receive no answer. And happy are generous people because they give some of their food to the poor. The Bible even suggests that compassion for others is a form of worship. It's a form of being obedient to God. Speaking on behalf of God, the prophet Hosea writes, I desire faithful love, not sacrifice. And Jesus quotes that very verse to the Pharisees and urges them to go and study what it really means.
You know, that somewhere in the gospel, Jesus tells us, I think it's before he sends them on the Great Commission, he says to the disciples, the poor will always be with you.
That's correct.
So I keep thinking, I remember that, and I keep thinking, there's never any bottom to this. You can only do what you can do, and the rest, hopefully somebody else will come along and pick it up. I saw that happen. I witnessed it in Baltimore and the black populations there. You talk about the sins of a father last 7 generations, you know, in the Old Testament. You see evidence where these people have no idea. They have children that don't ever leave the house because the parents are gone or on drugs or whatever. They will never be able to engage in society at the speed that it's moving. They'll never be able to get on the train that's going too fast. And it's all over the town. I mean, it's just, I assume it's in Chicago too. That's why they shoot each other.
Well, I think one of the great tragedies in what you're saying, you mentioned we can only do what we can do.
Right.
The tragedy is all the things that people could do that they don't do. That we don't do the things that we could do.
Yeah, good point.
And that's
Yeah.
really where it affects us as a tragedy.
Yep.
Okay. In Scripture, God is constantly calling on those who cannot help themselves. So in a real sense, God does help those who cannot help themselves. There are so many ways in which God typically meets the needs of those who are poor, people who are struggling, people who are hurting. I mean, he does it by working through other people. He does it by putting it in the hearts of people to help. And we should always seek to find the best way to help without hurting and without creating dependence. People who think that they are Christians but have no compassion for those in need and do nothing to help them, believing that God only helps those who help themselves, have completely perverted the message of the gospel.
Well, I think some people like to say that, and then they can completely not have any guilty conscience.
Oh yeah,
or
they can
anything.
duck their
Yeah,
responsibilities.
like you don't help yourself, so God says to do that, so
That's
whatever.
the perfect excuse to
So
bail
I
out.
think it's an arrogant statement, actually.
Yeah.
But there is a segment of that population that is treatment resistant.
Oh, I know, yeah.
And they've already worked out a system, and they're not interested in changing into, you know, the mold that you may be trying to.
That's
get them
a
into.
good point, because it's on somebody who wants to help and make a distinction between those kinds of people. Because we made mistakes in our own benevolent fund in church here,
Yeah,
and we have leeches, professional leeches, that burned us. And it's like the guy that's homeless and hungry, and he has a sign, "I'll work for nothing," or you go to him and he says, "I just need $5 for food," and then you take him to McDonald's and buy him the food. You don't give him the 5. And
But I think
different.
the message behind all this is it is better to help and get taken than it is to not help someone who really needs to be helped.
It's hard. It's almost impossible
Oh, yeah.
sometimes until
I
it's
know.
too late.
I give a guy $20 that says he's hungry and he goes down and buys
Buys
$20 worth of beer
Or drugs, yeah.
or drugs, and but what if I didn't give him the 20 and it turns out that he's starved to death?
That's the problem.
That's
well,
the
I
problem.
think when you give somebody money like that, I think it's like anything else. You've chosen to do it, and you can't tell them what to do with it. I mean, in other words, yes, you're worried about it, but at the same time, if you're going to do it, you have to do it with an open heart and let it go. You don't have to be wondering all day if he bought beer or wine or drugs or anything, because maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but you tried.
Well, let me give you 2 more examples that Adam Hamilton has here in his book that I think apply to this. He said, one day after church around Christmas time, a member of our congregation who was unemployed told me that he had received an envelope, had no name on it, no return address, just a blank envelope. And when he opened it up, he found a $100 bill. As he told me the story, tears welled up in his eyes. Pastor, he said, you have no idea what that meant. I felt that God was speaking to me and helping me through someone here at our church. I knew at that moment that God had not forgotten me. That's how it works. In a similar vein, I recall watching a scene unfold in a hotel some years ago as a woman attempted to check in. She presented her credit card, the clerk processed it, but then informed her that it was no good, it had been refused. Well, the woman was really distraught. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't know where she was going to stay that night or anything else. So she walked away from the desk thinking that she could maybe use her cell phone to call somebody who might be able to help. And she told the clerk she would be right back. After she was out of earshot, the man who had been standing behind her in line had witnessed the situation. He stepped up to the counter and he told the clerk, I want to pay for that woman's room for the night. When she comes back, the man said, please don't tell her who paid. Just tell her it was a gift from God. Cool. I think I'm going to pretty well wind it up there today. The next thing we need to talk about, go ahead, Dave, if you want to. The next thing we need to talk about in relation to this same concept, this same belief. God's help for the helpless. God's willingness to help people who cannot help themselves. We have a name for it. It has 5 letters. Can you think what the name is? It's called grace. It's called grace.
5 letters. I thought you said 5 words.
Yeah, 5 letters. And this is a second way in which this belief is not really in line with the biblical truth. Sometimes we cannot help ourselves. Not because we are poor or destitute or without resources, but sometimes we cannot help ourselves because we have descended so far into sin or despair. And I'll leave you with this thought before we come back next week. God, our God, is the God of the hopeless cause.